Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling.
Hello and welcome back to the final, thank God for that, episode.
No, thank all myths.
Yes, of Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, here with Stephen Ramosi.
Hello.
And Scott Thurlow.
Finally, we can die.
Yes. I suppose this is our return, if you will, to end our heroic journey. Although I don't know how much we've been heroes here.
We'll find out right now.
But we're tackling tonight the epilogue and our final thoughts on this work on mythology. So we're beginning with the epilogue, which of course has a subtitle, Myth and Society.
Because why wouldn't it?
Yeah, like, I mean, do you think he's going to stop using subtitles?
And also
right
several
now?
chapters or sections.
Subsections.
2 sections.
Sub-epilogues.
I think it's 3 or 4.
Yeah, 3.
3? Yeah.
Oh, you're right. True.
Which the first is the Shapeshifter, which is a discussion of what is myth and various interpretations, or how others have perceived myth through time and through the study of myth. And I think he should have tackled this perhaps in the prologue, but
Well,
I see what you mean.
regardless.
I do like the fact that he kind of like sums everything up with like, here's what this person thought of this. Here's what, Jung thought of this. Here's what, like, all the other...
Sure. I have it this way. The myth has no, in quotes, final system to interpret it by. When my reference was, he did not reference it, but I have Sontag style, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah, like just that he's laying out, like, yes, there are various ways to interpret it, and it has been interpreted in various ways, but there is no no right way, essentially.
Yeah. Right. So I'm actually going to go over the section where he describes several of the different variations. I think this is what's really important to this section. Mythology has been interpreted by the modern intellect as a primitive, fumbling effort to explain the world of nature. Fraser. And I've actually have a work by Fraser on fire myths, but so I smiled when I saw the name. As a production of poetical fantasy from prehistoric times, misunderstood by succeeding ages, Muller, as a repository of allegorical instruction to shape the individual to his group, Durkheim, as a group dream, symptomatic of archetypal urges within the depths of the human psyche, Jung, as a traditional vehicle of man's profoundest metaphysical insights, Kumaraswamy, and as God's revelation to his children, the Church.
Close enough.
Mythology is all of these.
Yeah.
Yes.
Precisely.
Oh, just as you said earlier, Scott.
And I think that's a good summary of kind of what, all the different encapsulations of what myth has distilled itself into throughout the ages, and
also how so many people have approached myth through their own respective field.
That's
fields.
true.
Single laser lens, kind of. Yeah.
Jung, obviously, coming through psychology, looked at how psychology applies to myth, and all trying to capture myth as their own, as either a product of their own field or as kind of a foundational
as representative of it. Yeah.
And just Campbell's like, stop arguing. That's not myth itself.
They're all equally valid, and they all have important things to say.
Well, myth itself is its own field of study.
Sure.
And it has its own voice. So that is the Shapeshifter. So let's move on to the second aspect, or second subsection, which is the function of myth, cult, and meditation. So what he's discussing here is the role myth has played in the formation of different cultures, and not only myth, but ritual, religion,
and so forth.
all those
related aspects. Yeah, exactly.
And that often they're taken as superstition, but it's less superstition and more, in a sense, the unification of the tribe. It's tribal identity.
Well, I have my, again, yes, that is true, and that's what he lays out here. So, again, my humor is making myself amused to myself. I have a working class myth, A, is something to be. And secondly, we are all, I am he and we are she, and we are all Odysseus together.
Yes. But no, it's absolutely, like, what I really like here is his discussion of how divisions in society, that you can be a king, you can be a...
You might be
lowly street sweeper.
Exactly.
Sooner or later, you dance with the Reaper.
Sooner or later, you dance with the myth.
Sweet references on top of references today.
But you transcend your role, not only like how you make your income or what your role in society is, but like gender. It doesn't matter what race, ethnicity, gender, or any of these that you are, that you all become these heroes of myth. You become the trickster in
Anyone
myth.
could be any of those manifestations, if you will.
And so I like this. Going back to the less supernatural and more of a use of collective, like developing unification in the collective.
Well, I was going to say real quickly before, because I think you're about to do a quote, right? But at the end of the, text proper, I guess, he says something similar where he basically said, and he doesn't say this in these words, but he basically says,
paraphrase.
Listen, everyone is the hero of their own story, and that's kind of similar to where he's going with this, I think.
So, actually, I remember you were reading this before, and you kind of laughed at this section. No tribal rite has yet been recorded which attempts to keep winter from descending. On the contrary, the rites all prepare the community to endure together with the rest of nature the season of the terrible cold.
Exactly.
I definitely chuckled at that, specifically because at the time, while I was reading it, there were some other conversations going on about Game of Thrones. And
sure, you're an extra layer.
It fit perfectly into and that's by its own right, its own like modern myth,
But to be fair, like I was not amused, but I enjoyed that quote when I read it beyond the context of what you just said, and I think it's pretty exemplary of what he was basically summarizing here. And like, it's an interesting point.
A first year college student who was taking the first philosophy class and discovering marijuana for the first time.
Sure.
He starts going into how not only are we one with the tribe, but we also have to learn to be that we're all one in humanity and one in the universe.
Yeah, like I said, we are all Odysseus, or Heracles, if you will. Pick and choose.
So for the final section is the hero today, which, based on when this was taken, is the hero of our grandparents' generation.
Right.
The hero of yesterday.
Which actually I thought
Captain
was
yesterday.
A very interesting dialogue into what we have lost when we lost Smith.
Exactly. I thought that was the most interesting thing he raised. And like, just real quickly, to be fair, and we were pre-talking about this before this cast, that I wasn't sure like if there was anything to be had from the final 8 pages or whatever it is from Hero 1,000 Faces in these sections. But this one, I think, did have something sort of substantial. And like you said earlier, perhaps it would have been helpful if he introduced it earlier instead of here. But nevertheless, I thought it was very pretty impactful, pretty solid, and a good talking point.
Well, I think this wouldn't have had such a strong, or at least especially the hero today, wouldn't have such a strong message if you didn't understand where myth had come from. If you're a novice,
true. You're right. You're right about that. That's fair. Go on though.
But we live in a secular society who values individualism, and we become, oddly enough, the idea is the hero of our own stories, to the point when we don't, everything is about the individual versus we've lost the ability to connect with one another through a shared experience. And while I don't necessarily agree that there aren't things in our culture that we have shared experiences with, but I think he's saying that myth had played such a central role in
Previously,
societies that it unified the entire tribe, where now the tribe is fracturing because one tribe has its own,
there's
in a sense,
tribes
modern myth.
within tribes almost. Yeah.
I mean, I would say surely it's different, but to some extent that kind of smacks of old man looking back and saying yesterday was better. Like back in the good old days.
I see what you mean.
We knew how to be a tribe. We knew how to be a people, and I think that humanity's always kind of been like that.
Well, I have it this way again. Like my paraphrase, semi-humorous quotes. It's that Campbell basically is saying, modernly, even then when he was writing this, we've become machines almost. Bioshock style. It's about the individual. And he saw the coming, I have in quotes, social storm due to globalization and so forth, that we no longer, we either lose or have less reverence for those myths and so forth and stories of the past that represented something to the tribe that they were like ingrained in. Now that no longer, like that kind of dynamic doesn't exist anymore.
See, now you might disagree with this interpretation of it, Steve-O, but you had mentioned the old man looking back. I think what he's arguing is that myth is the centerpiece to civilization in a way. The idea is that it's the cohesive.
We can say it's one of the
between
cornerstones, if not the centerpiece.
And that and when it's missing, something needs to, or it's a vacuum, and nature needs to replace that.
Perhaps.
And what fills that void, and the quote I want to read next, and read my last quote.
Yes. I mean, not yes, last quote, but yes, please.
Yes, as exemplified by.
Show me this quote.
The community today is the planet, not the bounded nation. Hence the patterns of projected aggression, which formerly serve to coordinate the in-group, now can only break into factions. The national idea, with the flag as totem, is today an aggrandizer of the nursery ego, not the annihilator of an infantile situation. Its parody rituals of the parade ground serve the ends of Holdfast, the tyrant dragon, not the god in whom self-interest is annihilate. And the numerous saints of this anti-cult, namely the patriots whose ubiquitous photographs draped with flags serve as official icons, are precisely the local threshold guardians, our demon Sticky Hair, whom it is the first problem of the hero to surpass. Nor can the great world religions, as at present understood, meet the requirement, for they have become associated with the causes of the factions as instruments of propaganda and self-congratulation.
Exactly.
And the idea is that, or I love the idea that he's saying national propaganda replaces the loss of myth. Shallow religion replaces the loss of this great myth.
Of ubiquitous. Yeah, exactly.
But weren't myths always that? Weren't myths always some sort of like, I don't want to say national because
no, I see what you mean,
but like they were always that kind of propaganda for the collective,
kind of,
which is kind of like the same thing as what national propaganda became, right? Like, but for perhaps for a people with a shorter attention span or something like that, like
perhaps. Let me address it a bit. I see what you mean coming from that angle. But I don't know if like they weren't always like it's hard to get without rabbit holing ourselves.
Well, they definitely were. There were always these like.
I think the point is this: Campbell's arguing in this section, as is the hero today, is that there's somewhat of a disconnect between the nature and the function of myths in previous times to the modern globalization. Like I said, the world is not the community, as you just said. The Earth is its own community. Mm-hmm. So like that creates almost a necessary divide or gap between.
But also, if you have to look at the historical context of when this came out, which is the World War II era.
Sure.
So he's looking at, and a lot of what he's saying, the idea of national warmongers. I think.
I mean, it still kind of applies today.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But I think where he was writing from was the idea is that perhaps the world. I always kind of grabbed the idea that Campbell was maybe perhaps not a hippie, but he would have been a hippie if he grew up in the 60s. And saying the world would have been much better off and much more peaceful place, or as peaceful as it could get, if we had still this rudimentary structure of myth to work with versus, in a sense, flag waving
of it, yeah.
and nationalism.
That's the thing. Like I see that argument, but I also see that has always been an argument. Like that things used to be better, and now we've lost something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always been an argument.
I think it's a valid
people that feel like they're
mindset,
losing,
in a sense, yeah.
their sense of where the world is.
I'm sure the people who were watching the Greeks march upon Troy were reflecting back on brighter days when the world was more peaceful.
There's like a famous story about, I forget what it was, like Aristotle or Socrates or somebody saying like, oh, the youths. And when I was young, the youths were much more respectful to their elders. It's always been the case that looking back, there's something to be had. But what I like to take from something like this, and I think that's really important, is that you can look at this framework that he lays out, and you can see it in the myths that are being created today, in the stories that are being told today, and like you can still see the important foundation that was laid, in the infancy of humanity.
No, I get it. Sure.
That still continues on, and I think that's the most interesting thing. Things are always going to change.
See, I view it as more that especially the last section is Joseph Campbell with his own hero's tale. That he dedicated his life to myth. And he sees a huge power in mythology.
To be found there, sure.
And I think he's like, if only other people
could
would see
this. Yeah.
And I think this is his attempt to broker peace, to have his hero's journey. And I think everyone wants to find the thing that they love would solve what they view as the problems of the world. And you view that very cynically.
Well, that's what he was saying. Like, it's always been the case.
No. I don't view it cynically. To some extent, Joseph Campbell completely succeeded in bringing myth back around and making it a very important thing in the way that people tell stories. Hell, one of the biggest stories of the last 80 years or whatever is Star Wars, which is basically based off of this book,
which we'll be doing soon.
Yeah,
segue.
Good plug, Steve-O.
So
go on though.
I mean, if his intent was to make people aware and make people understand how myth works and make people understand why myth is important, then I think in terms of the storytellers of today and for the last, when was this written? In 40 something? 48.
Late 40s.
For the last 70 years or more, I think, no, slightly less.
Forget about the math. Forget about the math of myths.
I think that he succeeded. The main thing, the main, argument for that is that we're talking about it right now.
Sure.
We're talking about this book. I don't
disagree.
We went through this book chapter by chapter and talked about all of his points about how myths work and how important they are.
Unfortunately, it's just a lost signal.
Sure.
You're absolutely right. In this, we've already actually jumped on what I think will be our concluding aspect of this, which is discussing the importance of this. I just want to say that after reading this work, it actually changed the way I view narrative, especially narrative featuring heroes. I started looking at archetypes that he has outlined, like the plot structure, not just in like Star Wars, which is very famous for, but in almost any like movie or television, you can find pieces of what Joseph Campbell has observed.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
And I have to give it full credit for that. This is a work that changed the way I look at things.
The funny thing is, yes, that's true. If you look at like a good work of fiction, now you can see parts of Campbell in it. I think the weirdly strange thing is that if you look at a bad, like something that you think is bad, and you try to figure out why it's bad, a lot of times you can attribute it to not hitting these points that Campbell is talking about.
That's absolutely true.
I like
which
that,
which is really an interesting thing as well. You know, like looking back at it, he really nailed a lot of what makes a story good. And there's a lot more than what's in this book that goes into a story, for sure. I'm not going to argue that's not the case. But what I will argue is that, and obviously it's a huge work in the field for a reason, he devoted his life to figuring out what makes a story work, and he figured out a lot of it and wrote it down, thankfully, for a lot of other people that are trying to write stories, because I know that a lot of other people have used this as a foundation for their works.
In a way, it has relegated, he's taken myth and made what's called a family of resemblances with it, which these are different aspects of that. So one element might appear in, so take a random sample of 5 myths. One element appear in 4. One element might appear in all 5. One element may not appear in any of those. But these are
nevertheless
what exists in storytelling, and it has its place in history for a reason. Not everything works in this work. We've mentioned in previous casts that the first section is well worth a read. Segments of the second section, especially when he returns to the hero, are well worth a read. And the epilogue is the monomyth introduction as well. But there are parts to, like, at parts he just kind of talks about myths without adding any commentary to them. But I would say that at least the first part of this is well worth a read if you're interested in how narrative works. Absolutely. If you're interested in myth, the entire thing's interesting to read. But yeah, that's my final thoughts on Joseph Campbell.
I'll say this. I agree with like almost everything you guys just said. So I'm trying to keep my closing thoughts sort of concise. Yes, I'm glad we read this work finally. And you're right, to an extent, it has, at least, if not changed, at least made me think about the aspects that Campbell brought up in these sections that we thought were the strongest, as applied to any modern story that I see or hear or read, etc. So I think, yeah, it's an important work and stands for a reason. The reason isn't forgotten. And as we mentioned, another shameless plug, yes, we'll be doing Star Wars, which is probably like, as you said, Steve-O, the modern, within the past 50 years or whatever, that people can, if you have no idea or have never like studied or researched this kind of mythology, you recognize things because of that, right. and because Star Wars used Campbell's myth templates, as a starting point. So it's hugely influential, and even though it was sort of a rocky road for the things he laid out, and the things at least that we extracted more out of, and sometimes not. Nevertheless, though, it's an important, it's an impactful work that still deserves and still has resonates throughout all storytelling.
Absolutely. I would say it's well worth a read if you're interested in how storytelling works. Or if you're interested in reading myths
that you may never get in.
Or reading more mythology and you don't know where to start, just read this book. There's 1,000 examples in here. And like, honestly, if you're looking for recommendations, look no further than what's in this book. It will give you recommendations by all of its examples.
And beyond that.
And it will tell you kind of what they're talking about at the same time, which is a bonus.
Yep.
So I guess I'll end off with a shameless plug for us again. We will be doing presentations at the Mid-Atlantic Popular and American Culture Association, MAPACA, in November.
The conference in November,
in Philadelphia. If you like our work, I am doing a presentation on, actually, Hero with House of Faces, as it applies to the television show Legion. Would you like to get?
Yeah, I will be doing a talk on kind of depression and nihilism in Rick and Morty and BoJack Horseman.
And I will be doing a talk on combining elements of BioShock, of course, and Citizen Kane as related to video games and the auteur sort of style within that. So yeah, that sounds good to you. Either of those or all three, check us out. We'll be there.
And we should mention Chris will be talking about Star Trek or something.
Chris also is doing the kind of talk. He'll be there.
I believe it's morality and science fiction or something like that.
Yeah.
So
it's the sacrifice of the greater good or something like that.
Anyway, I'm Jonathan E. Manser, here with Stephen Hermosi.
Have a good night.
And Scott Thurlow.
And we have now completed our hero's journey, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.